Welcome to the first event of Manifold's Symposium on Experimental Criticism. My name is Emma Gomes, and I'm the co-editor of the journal and co-curator of this series, along with Jenny Cookson. We're coming to you from Colorado and would like to acknowledge that Manifold was founded upon land within the traditional territories of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho people. We're excited to celebrate with you the launch of our inaugural issue, which is available in digital and print editions on our website, manifoldcriticism.com. We're so proud of this volume and grateful that all our contributors will be presenting their work and thoughts in this symposium over the course of the next 7 weeks. I'll begin with a few words from our introduction to the issue. The impetus for this project is rooted in our conviction that existing models of criticism privilege and sustain prevailing hegemonies, and thus that critical form is in urgent need of intervention and innovation. The ambition of this venture is to disrupt traditional modes of academic criticism by publishing disruptive experimental critiques. Like Manifolds, the critiques collected in our journal are differential equations that narrate uncertainty and change, pushing to generate new paths of thinking. They refuse assimilation, morph from critique into object for critique, stage incursions into different disciplines and multiply dimensions, manifestations of critical thought made manifold. Our first panel today is titled Performative and Objectified Critique, and is co-hosted by Nightboat Books, a nonprofit organization which seeks to develop audiences for writers whose work resists convention and transcends boundaries, something very much in line with Manifold's own mission. Performative signals a critical practice in which the words or structure of a text enact a critique. Objectified describes a text which, in the act of interpreting the object of critique, creates a new object. In both cases, critical engagement is manifested through its utterances. In performative and objectified critiques, the critic inhabits a permeable space, a threshold which oscillates between the imaginative and the critical. In preparing for this panel, we asked ourselves and our panelists to consider the following questions. How do your experiments perform your critical thinking? What kind of pedagogical and affective engagement can this yield? How does the epistolary mode shift the critical register? How is the rethinking of vocabulary important to reframing a critique? How can documentary and creative practices rupture a critical text to offer generative footholds? With these questions in mind, I will now introduce our first panelist, Sophie Seita. Sophie Seita is an artist and academic working with text, sound, and translation on the page in performance and other media. She's the author most recently of My Little Enlightenment Plays from Paminar Press, which will be co-hosting another one of our panels later this month. The translator of Uljana Wolf's Subsisters selected poems from Belladonna, and the editor of The Blind Man from Ugly Duckling Press, named one of the best art books of 2017 by the New York Times. She works internationally on various projects and has performed at La Mama Gallery, Bold Tendencies, and the Royal Academy, among many others. In 2019, she had a solo exhibition of text, video, and performance props at Space in Hackney. Following her junior research fellowship at Queen's College in Cambridge, she's currently an assistant professor at Boston University, working on a book of lyric essays called Lessons of Decal and The Gracious Ones, a philosophical ballet in pieces. In Sophie's piece featured in Manifold, Decals of Love or the One True Imposter, a lyric lecture on Wendy Lotterman's poems, close reading becomes a sort of metonymic substitute for physical closeness to our far-flung friends and literary colleagues. In confirming the potential for close reading, she writes that, quote, close reading can be a thinking with a text, alongside it, in delightful entanglement, thus staying true to its spirit, but also taking it as an occasion for going elsewhere. It is my pleasure to introduce Sophie Seita as our first reader of the Manifold Symposium.
Define quite pragmatically as a play with conventions and expectations. What that means, though, is dependent on different contexts. So how visible or legible that experiment is at any one time, or how effective or affective. I think it's also a question of community and how that community interprets a specific experimental form and what political or social claims that community attributes to that form. Experiment also has something to do with intention. A specific use of a form or medium or mode of distribution doesn't always mean the same thing. So one example would be the use of fragmentary syntax or the non sequitur, which has historically either been seen or declared as maybe being the result of a generation raised in front of the TV, even infected by the rhetoric of Reaganism. I'm taking this from a conversation in the magazine Sulfur from 1987. Conversely, fragmentary syntax has been seen as a dialectical tool for drawing attention to the embedded power structures in rhetoric. At other times, fragmentary, non-linear forms were championed or dismissed as supposedly feminine styles of writing. So I could go on and on about this attempt at a definition of experimental criticism. And I think similar to any attempt at defining the avant-garde, it's always an ongoing and necessarily provisional discursive construction within a number of different and disagreeing communities with changing tastes and affiliations. To be experimental is also to be read as experimental. Our modes of reading determine the understanding of our objects, even their material form and creative practice. Which brings me back to performance and how readings perform their convictions, their material reality. And I'm particularly interested and have been for a really long time in the question of how the experimental lecture or the lecture performance in particular might perform knowledge. And for me, the lecture performance is a type of experimental criticism, live experimental criticism. And it sits more or less comfortably between art and academia, between creative production, analytical reception, and is all about an experiment with the production and sharing of knowledge. So in experimental lectures, things might be happily ambivalent, confusing, contradictory, or slow. Lecture performances are in a position of adjacency. Emma, you mentioned earlier this kind of alongside. I'm really fascinated by this preposition, being beside or alongside an object, a work. There's also kind of an alongside of a conventional epistemic framework. So we could say that the experimental lecture drags conventional epistemic practices and offers alternatives, maybe the associative, the speculative, the non-linear, the visual, the oral, the sensual, the embodied. Lecture performances offer ways of knowing that are different from the legible facts of our prescription drugs. They negotiate questions of legibility, of non-transparency, of waywardness. And I, as a critic and performer, can ask and perform these questions simultaneously. And I'm so fascinated by the lecture performance because that's a form I've been experimenting with for now a few years. And what draws me to that form and continues to hold my attention is that I think the lecture performance or experimental lecture is kind of all joyful artifice and highlights the performative nature of lectures. It drags the skeleton out of the closet. It shows its own workings. While maybe narrative or specifically certain narrative and theatre works are more invested in the fourth wall and might use mechanisms of deception, lecture performances are maybe more self-reflexive and employ techniques of disclosure and aim to explode the formal integrity of a genre or work, which is formally without tensions. So the lecture performance is performative gestures foreground its process of being made, setting up an aesthetic of producing, hermeneutics of textual evolution, rather than an aesthetics of the closed work. the piece I contributed to Manifold isn't quite a full-blown lecture performance in the way I define it or how I've used it in the past, where I would maybe wear a costume or have a set or do some movement, have music, etc. But I've called it a lyric lecture, a piece that very much thinks about performative timing, poetic expression. And when I first presented it live, I had some lecture slides that were used as my poetic interlocutor. So the slides and quotations could be differently timed. Decals of Love, or the One True Imposter, is also performative in the way it uses and distributes language and citation as if in a performance, where the poem speaks to me or I through it, in some kind of ventriloquizing of the object, which is the poem. So I'm very interested in pace and how we can maintain a sense of liveness, live thinking that unfolds over time, which is, I think, the lecture performance's medium-specific affordance. Thinking that is absorbed orally and visually at the same time. And that really fascinates me about experimental criticism and experimental lectures, to witness thinking in process. So Decals of Love is a love letter to love poems, to queer love poems. It's a piece of writing that performs the act of reading, that performs friendship, the reading of each other's loves and failures of love that can tie friendships together. It's also, I think, about too close reading, something that's a bit too close that you misread, the sending of poems as a way of continuing or starting a conversation, poems as stand-ins, as substitutes, and also what queer love poems might teach us about interpretation more broadly. And I'm reading these poems by Wendy Lotterman in a specific way as an expression of my love for them. I'm enamored with their language. They give me joy and pleasure, and my writing therefore tries to match that pleasure or desire. So to end, I'll just quote from a short section from the piece that comments self-reflexively on what it's trying to do, and maybe what attracted me to the poems in the first place. It's rather awkward to declare love and not receive a response. So Wendy Lotterman's poems have called out their love, and I shall answer their calling. They weren't written for or about me, but I am, for the purpose of this lecture and my life, claiming them for myself. And this is a key feature of the love poem as much as for the love song. We want to make it ours. I felt and feel cushioned by Lotterman's words, how they hold me, have held me. How not to psychoanalyze when you know the poet? Once we enter the realm of professionalized education, we are taught not to read for pleasure and rather to subsume our pleasure into a sublimated critical distance or historicizing, moving away from straightforward value judgments. This becomes somewhat more complicated with contemporary work when we can actively shape not only the canon, but also contemporary debates and feelings. What are we reading for? And what would it mean to read along with the pleasure? Lotterman's poems lend themselves to being read to a lover as pleasurable prompts for seduction, which puts a different spin on the question of the avant-garde's often proclaimed desire for or lack of efficacy. Wendy's poems are very effective. Given they are queer and they've been put to the test in explicitly queer situations, we could say that they are therefore also socially effective, not just romantically. Are we allowed to read and use our friends in this way? It's a form of homage. That would be the conventional and academic framework. But I'm also making Lotterman's words mine by uttering them in a specific situation, which we could call a romantic situation. It's situational appropriation. It's the best kind of impersonation via poetic language. I'll stop here because it's quite difficult, I think, to actually quote from the main body of the piece because it's quite procedural in nature and sort of responds, the different lines respond to each other. So I hope you'll check it out. So the lyric lecture really proceeds to use Wendy Lotterman's words alongside my own, or those I've made my own, to present my case, my encomium, at Plato's notable philosophical symposium, whose subject is, after all, love. So I'll stop here and thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here, and if people read it and have any thoughts or comments, I would welcome them. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophie. I'm actually going to ask you guys to unmute yourselves and make some noise and clap for Sophie. And yeah, as she said, her piece is live right now on our website, so please go check it out. I'm completely enamored by the lyric lecture. So we'll move to our next panelist now, Jordan Scott. Jordan is the author of Silt, Blurt, Decomp, a collaboration with Stephen Collis and Ecosphere of British Columbia, and Night and Off. His chapbooks include Clearance Process and Lanterns at Guantanamo. Both chapbooks treat his experience after being allowed access to Guantanamo Bay in April of 2015. Scott was the 2015-16 Writer-in-Residence at Simon Fraser University and the recipient of the 2018 Latner Writers Trust Poetry Prize for his contributions to Canadian poetry. Scott works with Brock Rossell at The Elephants, an independent press. TheElephants.net is the website. Jordan's piece in Manifold, Lanterns at Guantanamo, moves through different mediums. By way of visual art, somatic experience, and sonic witnessing, he takes us through his methodology, which attends to the shift between light and dark, between enforced silence and speech, between censorship and permission. In his own words, I wanted to look for and listen to possible instances of insurgency and contestation, to critical acts of resistance, insurgent interpretations, incendiary acts that would mark a breaking out and breaking from the frame of my embeddedness. I first heard Jordan present this piece a few years ago, and his sounds and words have stayed with me ever since. I'm so excited that he's here with us today and a part of this new venture. Welcome, Jordan.
Oh, yeah, thanks a lot for having me. I really appreciate the time and attention, and welcome everyone. It's so nice to see everyone. I think today I just will talk a little bit about the process and some of the ideas that formed my thinking about Lanterns at Guantanamo, and then perhaps read from the chapbook itself. So I've been investigating the Poetics of Stuttering for quite some time now. And that started out as a way to try to create a Poetics of Stuttering that would allow a kind of stutter in the language system as a whole, and that obviously came from my own stutter as a ways to reconcile with the way that my body works and produces sounds and syllables, as well as to try to explore a kinship between stuttering and poetry. But something that was always very interesting to me was the relationship between disfluency and lying. So as a stutterer, there's often a lot of suspicion in situations of power. So when there would be a stammer or a stutter in these situations, there would often be a suspicion of guilt or somehow not telling the truth. So that brought me to wanting to continue to explore this relationship between stuttering and lying, disfluency and lying. And that brought me to wanting to go to Guantanamo Bay. So I wrote them an email, which is always strange to say, but I did. I sent an email to U.S. Southern Command, and I asked if, and I applied to join one of their media tours. They have these media tours. They don't right now, but they did previously, about once a month. So I applied as a poet researching disfluency and the connections between interrogation and disfluency. And they accepted my application, but then once I arrived to Guantanamo, or shortly before, they said I would not be able to speak to anyone at all involved in interrogations. So I had to adjust, and it became that became the moment that I asked if I could record ambient sounds from in and around the prison, and I was then given permission to do so. The sergeant said in his letter to me that that would be perfectly fine. So I thought I would just read from a section of the book that talks about that the moment and the process of doing that. In my correspondence with Lieutenant Lay, I shifted discussion away from interrogation and towards sound recordings. Lieutenant Lay applied recording ambient environmental sounds and what not here will be a perfectly fine. The activity of recording is not a neutral act. A body is present. The recordings were often interrupted by my breathing, the rustling of fabric, or my footsteps. These mediating traces form a sonic register of the troubling ethics of my presence at Guantanamo. My body allowed access to perform my own egress. And I often think of what I was listening for, as opposed to listening to. When I was allowed to walk alone through the open air prison camp X-ray in the middle of the night, sound was absence, beguiling, out of sight, out of reach. The crickets hiding their forms, the wind in unlocatable grasses. How easily I walked in and out of the open air cells. How I planted myself in the interrogation booths behind the main prison compound and farther up the valley, attuned to distant signals eavesdropping on the ghosts and their chatter. At Guantanamo, the ambient sounds that Lieutenant Lay judged perfectly fine to record seem to seep into everything confident, aggressive, and excessively veiled. With my headphones on, everything was an amplitude of pastoral and machinal drone. But who gets to hear what? In what rarefied moment would a detainee hear a bird call, the wind or the sea? The pastoral sounds were always mingled with an insistent mechanical drone, a mundane signal that here could be anywhere, anytime, any place. And yet the signature remains intact. The ambient sounds of Guantanamo are as recognizable as the blacked out lines of a redacted poem. The ambience and redactions that Guantanamo engenders are representations of sonic operations of power, containment, and torture. Even if all my access was to be so tightly controlled and orchestrated, I nevertheless hoped that my ambient recordings would signal some of what is uncontainable in utterance, breath, and soundscape. So I'll stop there, and thank you for everybody for listening. I appreciate the time.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Let's unmute ourselves and clap for Jordan, make some noise.
Thanks, Jordan.
Really beautiful. His piece is also on the website, and it's just fascinating to see how he interacts with the environment around him. So I highly recommend it.
Yeah, and just as a reminder, if you popped in late, if you go to the events page of our website, we've live linked the 4 essays for our panelists. So hover over their name on the events page, and you'll be able to pull up a PDF of their essay, and we'll keep those links live until Sunday, so you can kind of read along with our panels as we move through. So thank you to Sophie and to Jordan. Again, I'm Jenny Cookson, and I'm on our co-editors of Manifold. So I'm just going to move right on to Adra Raine. Adra is the author of Want Catcher, published by the Operating System 2018, and she recently completed her PhD in contemporary US poetry at UNC Chapel Hill, North Carolina. She's currently editing a book manuscript based on her dissertation, Resonance Over Resolution, Resisting Definition in Susan Howell, Nathaniel Mackey, and Ed Roberson's post-1968 Poetics. And she's working on a creative project titled Undissertating, which is or isn't what it sounds like it might be. I love that, Adra. Her piece in Manifold, Leaves of Grass in Decolonial American English, an experiment, is a work of speculative literary criticism that imagines an alternate history of English by inventing a new idiom, what she calls decolonial or clofa English. And she translates Whitman through its decoloniality. And I was rereading her essay for this panel, and it struck me that clofa and its characterization at the introduction in the essay redounds throughout all parts of her piece. So she says that decolonial Leaves of Grass evokes the culture of Clofa English, whose lexicon was full of compounds, and it expresses the spirit of newness and creativity that Whitman wanted. And you'll see, but I think she might as well be writing self-reflexively. Her critique is itself compound, creative, new, and Clofa is a perfectly pitched metaphor for what she's doing. So without further ado, Adra.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and it's great to be here. When I began working on this essay, I was a doctoral student at UNC Chapel Hill, taking a course, the history. I got muted. Can you hear me? Okay, sorry. I was taking a course, The History of the English Language, in which I was learning about the social, cultural, and political history of English and its passage through the fires of Indo-European cultures, Anglo-Saxon paganism, Christianization, European Enlightenment, colonialism, and settler colonialism, and the democratic project of the United States on its way to 19th century American English. It was a history that I hadn't really studied much up to that point, and it was fascinating. There are all these turning points in the story where the language ends up going in one direction or another as a consequence both of circumstance and of political will. At the same time, I was writing a dissertation chapter on contemporary poet Nathaniel Mackie's work and what I call his creative etymology, to describe the way he traces and composes the cross-cultural roots of words, the way he brings into resonant relation words where a traditional etymology would not find a connection. When it comes to the definitions of words and excavating their history, Mackie turns to the West African Dogon name for the weaving block or loom, the creaking of the word, it's called, suggestive of the fabrication of meaning in language and of the way language fabricates. Mackie is often called an experimental writer in his poetry, fiction, and criticism, and my research focus has been predominantly on experimental poetry and criticism. In the literary history of experimental poetry in the US, Walt Whitman is often cited as the father of a lineage of US American liberatory poetics that we can trace from the 19th century to the present, through figures like William Carlos Williams and Langston Hughes, to Charles Olson and Robert Duncan, to Mackie and poets of our own contemporary moment. First published in 1855 and revised over his lifetime through 1892, Leaves of Grass was an experiment in writing what Whitman called America as the greatest poem, written in a vernacular American English in order to legitimize and liberate the American imagination from British tradition, to better perceive and express the place, the people, and the language of the landscape in which Americans lived, worked, and read. I began to wonder how the larger cultural history of the English language intersects with and shows up or doesn't show up in Whitman's language project. These parallel preoccupations, each having to do with the politics of language, led to an idea. I started studying the diction of Leaves of Grass to identify what kinds of words Whitman was choosing and what historical meaning they might reflect or carry with them, to tune my ears to the noise of the weaving block. And I started to see the history of the English language that I was studying playing itself out on the page. Words that entered the lexicon at different historical moments, carrying with them the cultural associations of that moment. For example, the word celebrate in the opening of Leaves of Grass, I celebrate myself, offers a good illustration of the Christianization of English as a procedure of displacing other potential linguistic developments. During the time of the Norman conquest in the 11th century, we see celebrate dominating the lexicon over some otherwise development of one of the Old English words, mercian. For cursory evidence of the significance of this historical juncture, we may look at the citations in the Oxford English Dictionary, where we immediately observe the usage of the word celebrate predominantly relating to public Christian events and rituals, masses, weddings, funerals, with that sense of the word then extending to civic events and finally to personal ones. We see then the way the Latinate and French roots settle into the life of the language with all of its religious inflections. Then I had a question. What if Whitman's project was not just about overcoming British English, but more ambitiously sought to overcome a deeper colonization of the language by Christian Europe? What if I took every word in Leaves of Grass that had Latin, French, and Greek roots and translated them into words derived from Old English? I began to play with this idea, and I found myself needing to imagine a cultural context in which such a project would exist. So I fabricated one. In my imaginary history, a 19th century group who I called the Decolonials argued that the emergent form of US English should place its roots in a pre-Christian English, what linguistic historians call Old English, and what I call, as you just heard in the essay, Clofa English, in order to sidestep the nostalgia of linguistic conservatism that shows up throughout this history in various calls to purify the language by returning to an Anglo-Saxon culture, which right now might invoke the image of that horned guy at the storming of the Capitol. Alternatively, I imagine the Decolonials project as one explicitly against the project of racist and xenophobic nation building. Not a return so much as a reinvention, I conceptualize the project of decolonizing US English as one that reclaims the concepts, senses, and experiences that Latin, French, and other European languages had ideologically colonized via the process of naming. The idea was to think of pre-Christian England as pre-colonial and that it precedes the settling of England by Christians, the Norman Conquest, the establishment of England as part of the European cultural tradition, including the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and colonialism. I imagined a Whitman who was inspired by the Decolonials project as he worked on Leaves of Grass by rewriting the first part of the first poem, Song of Myself, with replacements for the Latin, French, and Greek-derived words. My method for doing so involved consulting the Oxford Dictionary of English Etymology and the Oxford English Dictionary to learn the recorded etymology of each word in the poem, noting the historical context in which the word enters and becomes established in English usage. Then I found the Old English translation of the word using an online translator to weave together another sense of the meaning and generate synonyms. Then I looked for potential replacement words using a modern thesaurus and trying out existing words in English that have Old English roots. And then I also experimented with inventing compounds that get at the meaning of the word culturally and poetically. Why compounds? One of the distinctive characteristics of Old English, which it shares with other Germanic languages, is its compounding technique, making one word out of two, such as windmill or earlobe or candlestick. From this systematic yet also intuitive process, I produced a decolonial American English translation of the poem. And I'll share now the first 4 stanzas so you can see what I'm talking about. So on the left is the original. The words in blue are words with Latin, French, or Greek roots, and the green has Old English roots. I celebrate myself, and what I assume, you shall assume, for every atom belonging to be as good belongs to you. I loaf and invite my soul. I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass. Houses and rooms are full of perfumes. The shelves are crowded with perfumes. I breathe the fragrance myself and know it and like it. The distillation would intoxicate me also, but I shall not let it. The atmosphere is not a perfume. It has no taste of the distillation. It is odorless. It is for my mouth forever. I am in love with it. I will go back to the bank by the wood and become undisguised and naked. I am mad for it to be in contact with me. And then the translation. I thanks gather myself, and what I undertake, you shall undertake. For every word belonging to me as good belongs to you. I loaf and imbring my soul. I lean and loaf at my lightsomeness, looking at a spear of summer grass. Houses and rooms are full of sweet winds. The shelves are crowded with sweet winds. I breathe the sweetness myself and know it and like it. The brew would befuddle me also, but I shall not let it. The sky is not a sweet wind. It has no smack of the brew. It is noseless. It is for my mouth forever. I am in love with it. I will go back to the bank by the wood and become unmasked and naked. I am mad for it to befriend me. And then to see what this experiment amounted to, I then interpreted the translated poem in an essay of speculative criticism reflecting or referencing scholarship that combines real and invented historical documents and narratives with footnotes to both real and imagined sources. To close, I'll share a short sample of that analysis. The third and fourth stanzas are where we especially see the effect that decolonial American English has on the world words evoke. The earthy images of brew, sky, bank, and wood conjure a pre-industrial world, feeding our imaginings of an England of Clofa English, while the central images of breath, nose, mouth, unmasking sweetness and nakedness provoke a fantasy of uncensored life before Christian morality and Puritan prescriptions. Whitman's lexical innovations, sweet winds and noseless, and word choices like brew, befuddle, and smack, demonstrate a description of the world that doesn't rely on the medical and scientific sounding words derived from Latin and French that came into English use during the Enlightenment. Words that have similar meanings but connote different cultures. For instance, perfume or scent for sweet wind, scent or odor or aroma for nose, infusion, distillation, or extract for brew, intoxicate or inebriate for befuddle, and taste for smack, would produce a different poem entirely. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Woo! Woo!
Thank you, Adra. Our final panelist, Kazim Ali, where did I put his? There we go. There's your bio. Kazim was born in the United Kingdom and has lived transnationally in the United States, Canada, India, France, and the Middle East. His books encompass multiple genres, including the volumes of poetry, Inquisition Skyward, winner of the Ohio Book Award, in poetry. Winner of Alice James Books New York Award, The 40th Day, All One Flew, and the cross-genre texts Bright Felon and Wind Instrument. His novels include the recently published The Secret Room, a string quartet, and among his books of essays are the hybrid memoir, Silver Road, Essays, Maps, and Calligraphy, and Fasting for Ramadan, Notes from a Spiritual Practice. He's also an accomplished translator of Marguerite Duras, Sohrab Sepehri, Amanda Davey, and Mahmoud Chokralahi, and others, and an editor of several anthologies and books of criticism. After a career in public policy and organizing, Ali taught at various colleges and universities, including Oberlin, Davidson, St. Mary's College of California, and Naropa University. He's currently a professor of literature at the University of California, San Diego. His newest books are a volume of 3 long poems entitled The Voice of Sheila Chandra and a memoir of his Canadian childhood, Northern Light. And his piece in Manifold, there are 2 of them actually. The first is Painting, and then the second is Instruction Painting, Blueprint for an Installation, are selections from his book, Anais Nin, An Unprofessional Study, which guides readers through the movements and architectures of Nin's writing and a combination of critical essays and concepts for film treatment, choreography, and art installation. And perhaps he'll address this, but painting is the first, and then instruction painting is the second mode. So we've got both in there in Manifold. And Kazim is also a founder of Nightboat Books, our illustrious co-host for this panel. So thank you and welcome, Kazim.
Thank you so much, Jenny and Emma and everybody. And thanks so much for being here as well. Stephen Collis, whose name was mentioned earlier, in his book, Through the Words of Others, Susan Howe and Anarcho-Scholasticism, in addition to writing critically about Susan Howe's own creative practice, kind of also retroactively recognizes this lineage of what he calls anarcho-scholasticism, which is maybe an amateur or unprofessional, as I call myself in looking at Nin, literary critic engaging with a critical work, trying to write about it theoretically. And so he enacts that in the book on How. And How herself, of course, as the author of My Emily Dickinson, put herself in a lineage with work like Charles Olson's Call Me Ishmael. So this kind of literary criticism has existed for a long time on this shore. I think when we think of genre blending books in French literary movements in particular, we think of it maybe as un-American, but books like In the American Grain and Call Me Ishmael and My Emily Dickinson, and countless books that exist today do attest to a North American lineage as well for this kind of writing. The anarcho scholar. Nin herself was an unprofessional literary critic, and her first book was a book of criticism on D.H. Lawrence, and she called it an unprofessional study, meaning that she did not take on for herself that mantle of the critic or the academic. And I want to get back to that in a moment, because I think there are questions of authority in the old sense in terms of who has access to writing critically about work, and the ways about the ways in which work ought to be written about that would then be accepted or count, quote unquote, count as scholarship. And count as an economic word has, for those of us who do work in the academy, that word count is appropriate, because there are ways in which the intellectual labor that we do is quantified, and with real actual dollar amounts equal to numbers of pages, right? We can talk about that's the ugly truth behind some of the work that some of us do. Sophie mentioned some of this kind of being appellated. I'm losing my language now. Being termed feminine, quote unquote, feminine writing, and it puts me once again. It takes me across the ocean to France to think about l'écriture féminine, but the ways in which the writing that we do, the notion that a fragmentation of writing, or what might be seen in parts, is a type of the lyrical exploration of writing about literature. And I think that in ways, there was no other way for me to write about Nin, so it made sense for me to write about Nin in fragments, and it made sense for me to write about Nin in a nonlinear form, because Nin herself has been known in fragments. We had her novels, then we had her edited diary, then we have the quote unquote unexpurgated diary, which is not unexpurgated because it too has been edited and put together posthumously by editor. And Nin has never had a woman editor who created her diaries after she died. They were all men who put it together, and to this day is still. Right, so Rupert Pohl was the second husband. He's the one. Actually, John Farone, who was the publisher, is the first person who edited her. Then Rupert Pohl, who was her second husband. First and second doesn't matter, right? Because she was married to them both simultaneously. He was the one she married second, but he's also her first husband. They're both husbands. She had two of them. He became her editor, and then after he died, there's a gentleman named Paul Heron who lives in Texas, I think. I don't remember. But it's passed to him, and he now edits these books and puts them together. So the new diaries come from him. So none of them are under Nin's hands. So how to write about Nin critically, and as with many writers, the wishes of the estate, in this case, it's Paul Heron. It was Rupert Pohl, and then it became Paul Heron. But the wishes of the state preclude you as a scholar from seeing the archives themselves. So the original actual diaries and manuscripts are closed. They were open to one single person for a long time, and that was Evelyn Hines, Nin's official biographer, who worked on her biography for something like 40 years and never published it. And her husband then, in accordance with Evelyn Hines' own wishes, burned the 700 pages of manuscript after Evelyn Hines died. It's what she wanted, that's what he did. And now I think Paul Heron has access to those archives, and then select scholars do, a handful, one or two, or I don't even know all of their names. I know one person, he volunteered to take me in and see them. They're at UCLA. They're in UCLA. So that's the type of the approach to scholarship that one has to do. And one maybe finds that anarcho-scholarship, or scholarship that includes the tools of the poet and the dreamer and the shaman, is the only way to write critically about a writer whose work, number one, came to us in pieces in the first place, and to whom we actually don't have access to. So I want to think very quickly about the question of genre, because we can slide and slip in between genres. Scholarship that maybe starts out from fiction or starts out from poetry. And so I wanted to give I wanted to give 3 examples of different types of scholarship. The first is the Canadian writer Christiana Gunners, Icelandic Canadian writer Christiana Gunners, who has done a series of books that cross genre between memoir, fiction, and literary study. One of her novels, I just want to point out to you, this is a novel called The Rose Garden, and it's the story of a literary scholar who is in Germany, and then she has sort of like, there's an affair that happens, and she's working on Proust, and the book is actually, the novel, you can see, it looks like the typical kind of sexy romance novel. There's those flowers on there, but the subtitle of this book, this novel, Rose Garden, Reading Marcel Proust. And so it is at once a book of literary study and a book of fiction. And this is just one example of the kind of work that Christiana Gunners does, where the books are many things at once. Fiction is her starting point, but this next book that I want to show you is a book of poetry. It uses its starting point. It just came out, it's brand new. It's called The Age of Phyllis. It's by a writer named Anais Jeffers. This book uses archival research, to deep archival research, not only in the United States in archives that exist, but in Ghana and Gambia and other places in Africa, research in the slave trade, and looks at the life of Phyllis Wheatley. And it's actually, it's sort of a path-breaking book. She makes many innovations in biographical study of Phyllis Wheatley that had not yet been made by others. So she, as a poet who's writing in a lyric voice, not in an experimental mode, but in the traditional lyric mode, but nonetheless has to be recognized also as a scholar and critic, and that there's no ancillary work to this. There doesn't have to be something else that explains this book, that it is itself should be accepted as a book of biography and as a book of history, and a book of literary history and literary criticism on Phyllis Wheatley. And then the final example that I want to show you, which I'm really excited about at the moment, is this amazing book called Beholden, A Poem as Long as the River by Rita Wong and Fred Waugh. And it's a book that looks at the Jordan Atoll. Yeah, you know this book. Is the watershed of the Columbia River. And the book follows the path. The book is a, I guess you would call it a transcript of an actual physical exhibit. I don't think you can see this picture, but it's in a gallery, and it's a long scroll of paper, and it has the actual river, the river's watershed, and then the threads of text that run alongside it. And it's a book of poetry and criticism and political commentary in the shape of this incredible, I mean, who knows who's published this book? Talon. You know, what a dream if they had been able to do it as an accordion book, the way that Knox, you know, Anne Carson's Knox is done. But we'll do with the form of the codex, I suppose. So I think that these questions of these opening ways of approaching theorizing and writing about literary work, or geography in this case, or history in the case of the Age of Phyllis, to me was the only way to approach writing about Nin, since so much was not available. And because Nin's work has been almost hijacked by the biographical, and the deepest work on Nin was Deirdre Baer's 1995 book, Anais Nin, which was very, very obsessed with the biography and extremely interested in the most titillating facts of Nin's private sexual life. I mean, just, to like Keeping Up with the Kardashians level of obsession with her private life, which was then picked up by the critic Claudia Roth-Pierpont in a very famous essay about Nin's lies, the ways that Nin lied in her diary, that I think kind of finished Nin criticism for a generation, because people were just like, well, this woman was pathological. She's not an interesting writer. She's not an interesting writer because of who she slept with and how, actually. People stopped looking at her actual text. And so in my book, I went back to the fiction. Specifically, I excluded the diaries from my consideration, and I tried to engage in a way that was more towards the artistic, more towards the lyrical. And I think that these types of books, Gunners's book, the Wong and Watt book, the Jeffers book, these are books that they don't behave in the whatever genre they're supposed to stay in. And one always thinks about a book that doesn't behave in its genre in the same way that we think of the way that bodies themselves are gendered, that they need to be read and interpreted in a certain way. They need to follow the conventions of that form. And if they don't, they are excluded. They can't be considered, So in what ways might one of Christiana Gunners's novels, if one of us were to write it as a qualifying for a PhD, how is the committee going to view that or take that? So I'm, as a scholar and as someone who's in the academy, want to also throw out here, if it's interesting for you to think about, it's interesting for me to think about, so that's why I'm throwing it out to you. It may not be interesting for you to think about, that's okay. But I do want to throw out that one challenge might be how to develop concepts that can guide this practice of experimental criticism or lyric criticism in a way that will enable those of us who don't teach at UCSD or Brown or Naropa, because I think if you teach at either of those three places, you might be okay, or Buffalo perhaps. But for the rest of us, can we develop concepts to help us guide this practice and guide our colleagues to be able to read and understand and experience this work? If we're situated in creative writing programs, how can we get our colleagues to take seriously the critical work? Because they might not always. And the flip side is true. If we're in a traditional English department, how do we start to position this work that we're doing in a way that it can be seen as serious criticism, but without damaging the practice itself? That's the danger. So that's where I'll close, and just some scattered thoughts, but thank you for listening.
All right, so thank you so much to all four of you. As I was listening, I have my list of questions, and as I was listening, I had so many more questions come up, and right now I'm sort of vacillating between, should I ask questions that are very specific to your presentations, or a lot of Susan Howe kind of kept coming up with several of you, and it certainly is my touchstone text. Hopefully you guys will all go to the website and read the introduction, but she makes her way into that piece as well, that Emma and I sort of feel our connection to her really deeply. And I was thinking about both her notion of editorial control and sort of it being gendered. And then also what she says in the Talisman interview, she says, behind the facade of academia is a scaffold and a regicide. Under the ivy and civility, there is the instinct for murder, erasure, and authoritarianism. And that's first one of my favorite quotes from that book. But also, I'm wondering maybe if we could start the Q&A with perhaps all of you kind of ruminating on what it means to be an academic, a creative, a critic. Some of you are further along in your career. Some of you perhaps had to fight some battles to innovate, to be experimental in your work because you were younger, or not as far along in your career. So I maybe just want to kind of start with some ruminations on this kind of scaffolding and what it means to your own personal relationships to academia and to criticism. Go ahead and unmute yourself and speak.
No one wants to go first, so I will go first. I mean, I think in Nin's case, from the very beginning, she was. So we often, you're talking about youth and conformity in a way, and I think in many cases, a writer will discover themselves as they unfold in certain ways. And it happened in Susan Howe's work too. If you look at the earliest books in frame structures, they had a very different approach to, I mean, she's coming from the visual arts world, so she's still writing very concretely visual poetry in frame structures. But she's writing in a much more kind of traditional personal lyric voice and autobiographical lyric voice. And she moves into those textual explorations in later books, and then in the most recent books completely, unraveling the notion of the page and the text in the first place. So you can kind of see a progression. And in many writers, you see them like finding their own voice as they travel onward. Virginia Woolf or Jory Graham, or I could think of any number of other, or Marguerite Duras, where you see the voice developing and the kind of style flowering. And in a lot of these writers, we don't even really look at their earliest books anymore. I mean, like The Voyage Out, Virginia Woolf's first and her second book too, right? Or Duras's first couple of books. We like sort of pick it up at that point where they get their voice under them. And I think Nina's really interesting in that way because her first book is her most formally radical, The House of Incest. And she actually tried to make a go of it as a commercially successful writer and try to write these novels that she thought were going to sell to New York publishers. And in fact, the first couple of them did, because her self-published short stories that when she first arrived in New York, she got in the hands of a number of really important critics. And so then Dutton, I think it was Dutton, actually, who picked up her next couple of books and did two or three books in a row by her that were novels that I think she imagined were going to be commercially successful novels, but they're these really experimental, bizarre texts, and I don't think anybody really got them. And so she was eventually dropped and then went back to tiny publishers for the rest of her publishing career until the diary came out. So I think there is a point at which the audience has to learn, the writer has to learn who they are, and the audience has to learn, what they want. But there is something around who's going to be taken seriously as a writer, because when Nin was doing House of Incest, that's when she was working with Henry Miller, and his earliest books are completely traditional. Once he starts associating and affiliating with Nin is when that style that we understand as Henry Miller's style now, from Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn and Black Spring, that is from Nin. She was doing that first. And yet he was taken very seriously for it, of course. And the same is true of Marguerite Duras. Marguerite Duras was hired to write the screenplay for Nin's novel, Spy in the House of Love, and she didn't do it. And then the next year, she published The Ravishing of Lowell Stein, which is essentially the same plot as A Spy in the House of Love, but it's written in Duras's style. Duras is in Paris, Nin is in New York. That book, Nin's book, sank like a stone. And of course, we know what happened with The Ravishing of Lowell Stein. So it's context of where you are, who you are. All those things that we pray do not matter in terms of the reception of literature. And yet, guess what? They do.
Go ahead, Sophie.
Oh, sorry. Oh no, did you want to go? Go ahead, please.
I'll go after you.
Okay, I was going to say two things. One is sort of about that question of what it means to be an academic or a critic, and I think it's actually the same question that you might ask of, what does it mean to be a poet and an artist? And I think there's a certain responsibility and care that comes with that. It's also about an address to a specific community. And I've been thinking a lot about audiences. I've also been thinking about alternative forms of education, self-led programs. I'm part of this artist development program called Constellations at the moment, where we're really thinking about socially engaged practices, and we're organizing quite a lot of sort of self-led workshops, undoing those traditional hierarchies in academic institutions. So I feel like that we could take some of those things on board for more traditional academic learning or scholarship. And the other thing I was going to say about being a critic who's also a poet and an artist, or or maybe people working in film or music, is that we can borrow from these different disciplines and forms. And one thing I both maybe hate and love about more traditional academic scholarship and sort of rigorous, serious research is that it's actually incredibly humbling, because you realize that someone's already been there before you and has done some research and has given you a kind of network of footnotes that you can follow. And there's a generosity in that, and a humbleness, a modesty in that I appreciate, and I feel like I can take on board. Conversely, I would say what I maybe both hate and love about creative work, whether it's performance or poetry or visual art, is that so anything can be interesting and anything can be kind of made personal. And so I feel like that maybe experimental criticism or the lecture performance or interdisciplinary work can sit between these and take things or respond to these two seemingly maybe opposing impulses.
So I'll speak a little bit about my personal experience. When I was a graduate student at UNC Chapel Hill, I was in the English department. It's a fairly traditional program. There is an MFA at Chapel Hill, but there's not an MFA. There's no MFA. There is an undergraduate creative writing program that is great and very strong, but there's no connection between the graduate studies and the undergraduate program. And in fact, when I tried to make that bridge, it really didn't work out at all. Though there were a few of us in the PhD program together who were also creative writers, some with MFAs. But trying to do a more experimental project, both in terms of who I was studying and the way I wanted to approach my work, was really tough. I went through 3 dissertation committees before I settled on a committee that would support the work I was doing. I was very close to leaving, and there was that option of maybe you should just go somewhere where you should go to Buffalo or something, where that work is supported. At that point, when that kind of became something I was thinking about, I was already like 3 or 4 years in, so the question of kind of like, what do you do at that point? And decided I would just find my people, which I did, both in terms of my peers and also faculty who would work with me and support the work. Something that came up along the way too, which was interesting, is, Susan Howe is an interesting exception. In 19th century literary studies and the study of Dickinson, Susan Howe's My Emily Dickinson was actually taken seriously, right? It was accepted as serious scholarship with a huge impact actually on Dickinson's studies in the 80s. But she's kind of, the message I got is she's an anomaly. That doesn't mean you can do that. That's like, if you're Susan Howe, you can do that, but 1 in a million people is a genius like Susan Howe. So I do think it's interesting to think about, can more traditional programs embrace it, but not as an anomaly, but as a model that upcoming scholars could actually, follow in the footsteps of and learn how to do, not just as the wild genius who happens to get away with something unconventional. I like, in terms of, a system that supports that work. I mean, when I finished, I felt so kind of wrecked by that whole experience. I really needed to step away from academia. And I think I'm still vacillating between whether academia is a place, if the university is a place where I can think and write the way that feels important to me. It feels like such a compromised space. It's so driven by market pressures, all the way through, from the classroom to publishing to tenure. Yeah, so I don't know. I'm right now, I vacillate, but now I'm at the point of like, maybe it's better just to be looking for creating a whole different alternative where the work is supported and read and taught, and but that can become its own economy as well, with its own market pressures. So, that's the 21st century for you. I feel stuck.
I want to jump in here. I apologize, I can't turn my camera on for some reason, or change my name. So this is Anne Leslie Seltzer. Thank you so much to everyone who presented. Amazing, and thank you for putting this magazine together. And I apologize that I kind of ditched out on contributing, sadly. I wanted to pick up on exactly what Adra is just talking about. That was my question. In as far as this is a kind of limit work, I was interested in the potential for like directing the question out away from the university, I guess, out away from like fitting in or finding a place that accepts it, or a way to capitalize on it, and ask the presenters about like the intersection that this kind of work has with capitalism, how it's challenging certain things that seem set, certain limits. I heard the word regicide at some point. I forget who mentioned it, but that resonated with why I do this kind of criticism, a kind of dethroning of authority and all the things that's, associated with it now in terms of patriarchy, racism, and capitalism. So sorry for the convoluted question, but I wanted to bring up that topic or redirect the conversation that way.
Susan Howe's relationship to regicide is a little more complicated, because I think she's positioning the writer as like the king or the monarch of the text, and the editors and the scholars who come in as those. I mean, the metaphor that she uses in the Icon Basilicae bibliography of the King's Book, which is collected in her book Nonconformist Memorial, is around the Cromwell and the execution of King Charles. So it's like, it's a critique of, like, she's critiquing the killers of the king, in a sense. She's not supporting the dethroning. Like, I mean, I think she wants the author to have authority. I mean, she's the, and when she goes into the texts, the notion of the telepathy of the archives for her is like, she does not want to dethrone the other authors. She wants to go amongst them and create from them and be with them, and not have a colonizing role as an editor or a scholar. I think this is my interpretation.
Thank you, Anne, for the question. I think it's interesting to think about how capitalism is obviously very good at incorporating even anti-capitalist gestures. So if we think of creative critical work, or even kind of the mixing of genres, and how that's now also maybe a selling point, right? I mean, if we think about autofiction being, so many books that are labeled autofiction, kind of bestsellers, or a kind of marketing of identity, identity categories, whether that's publishing or in curatorial models, and how a lot of terms are bandied about, like care. You see like so many art institutions, especially during the sort of first wave of the pandemic, mention care, and you wonder like how much do institutions obviously actually care for the bodies that are in them. So yeah, I think that's a difficult question to really grapple with, and this is why I would be cautious to say that specific forms are automatically anti-capitalist, which is also what I was saying earlier when I started my my short commentary on the kind of history of a particular form or genre. That history needs to be considered. It's not a kind of, there's nothing pure about a particular form. Like lots of different people can use and misuse a form in different contexts. So something can be claimed as being capitalist and anti-capitalist at the same time. But yeah, thank you for the question.
I wanted to ask Jordan a question about like being part of a system and out of a system in relationship to sound. And I recently read a few times your new children's book, I Talk Like a River, and what that feels like to be in a classroom situation and to be creating sound that sounds noisy. And I'm just interested in terms of those relationships to, I think what we're hovering around different systems.
Yeah, hi Sarah, nice to see you. That's a great question. I think that, so maybe I'll answer this in a kind of roundabout way, starting with maybe talking about lanterns at Guantanamo. One of the really intriguing kind of byproducts of me visiting the prison was the realization that one of the reasons I was allowed access was because I identify as a stutterer. So I didn't realize that until I got there, and the soldiers responsible for allowing access all had these narratives that they were excited to share with me about other people who in their families who stutter, and how brave they thought I was for being there and talking about the stutter in that way. So it was very interesting to me in terms of creating sound in those spaces, this kind of confluence between this otherwise very aggressive space and me having these conversations with these men and producing my own unusual sounds and prolongations and whatnot. And I thought a lot about Susan Howe when I was there because of some Susan Howe's ideas on hesitation, which really informed a lot of my thinking about the stutter. I forget the exact quote, but it's something. It was a response to Charles Olson's very aggressive projective space, right? And how has this really wonderful idea of hesitating as a way to counter that is all that is confident and aggressive. So in terms of that was what I found intriguing in those moments, in terms of the different soundings in this particular space. So, and in terms of the classroom, as you said, for children's work and talking to them, it's just a much different experience overall, I think. One that I don't think I have figured out yet. It's very difficult for me to articulate that yet, in terms of what that kind of sound and listening does in a classroom, as opposed to reading poetry for adults. They're both performative, but obviously the reactions are quite different, and that's something that I think I'm still absorbing and trying to figure out.
Beautiful.
I was thinking too that there's a kind of sympathy between Jordan, you and Adra both talk about, well, Adra said sort of tuning her ears to Whitman was how she approached it, and your sensitivity to the ambient noise brings up these kind of conjunctions between listening and speaking. And what I'm kind of thinking about is that perhaps for both of you, and correct me, but it seems like there's this kind of hybrid communication that is both simultaneously and that is not hierarchical, right? Because we privilege speaking over listening because it garners attention, but to, you know, this kind of hybridized form, it seems to me like both of your pieces are doing, and you're both kind of communicating in those ways in this panel presentation. And I think that sympathy is really interesting also.
And this is leaping a little bit from what you just said, Jenny, but I think I've been thinking about writing, kind of the current state of writing, and how it seems to me we're in a cultural moment where writing is so understood as a statement. It's so conclusive, even when it's published as an experimental piece, right? It's kind of it's just there, and it's not, rather than a process that's part of a dialogue that gets a response, or that's a starting point for a conversation, or that is a middle point on the, you know, in a journey or a kind of exploration, and that's one of the things that that feels really restrictive at this moment in the kind of as writers. I love writing, but it's become both a tool of the market and a commodity, even when we don't want it to be, just because of the practice, the way that we read, the way that we talk to each other. You know, do we have time to respond and discuss rather than just exchange writing? And that has to do with listening too, and responding. And I think we're also expressing, I think, appreciation for writers who in their writing practice are in a are in a practice of listening and responding to the text that they're writing about. But outside of that too, like our relationship with one another as the people who we're writing to and for and with.
Can I just jump in here, because I'm just thinking about listening, which leads me to maybe the best kind of citational practice, or kind of thinking about how citation is a form of acknowledgement of listening to other voices and bringing them to the surface, or being in conversation with them. Again, like, or putting them side by side with our critical voices, rather than trying to dominate them, right? So rather than being like the critical voice who maybe simplifies and explains and compartmentalizes and hierarchizes information, or these voices that we talk about. So there's maybe could be a more horizontal relationship, kind of horizontal citational practice, or presence even in the mise en page. So I think it also is like something about design, or that I'm interested in. And yeah, how can we make this listening, or these other forms of listening, also present and visible? Yeah.
And please jump in if any other participants have a question. There's so many pages, I can't see you, so just jump in if you have a question.
I have a question for Adra. I'm fascinated by your idea of translation and the tools you used, because a lot of what's being talked about by these people, to me, is very relevant. I have a radio show in North Idaho, and I incorporate songs and poetry. And for me, my environment is really non-academic, but my roots at Naropa are very much consistent with what you're talking about here. And I resonate with this experimental approach to critical analysis. But it's almost like a language differential. You almost have to create a lexicon or dictionary that show you're communicating, or how you're going about making a meaning that might be able to communicate. So my question for you is, do you find this the concept of translation to be relevant to the rest of your work?
Thanks, that's a great question. Yeah, translation is an interesting word. You know, that sense of kind of the acrossness, I think, is part of what you're getting at, kind of communicating across difference, right? Which can be registered on so many different levels. And I think as you were talking, I just remembered this is kind of a random anecdote, but when I was at one point kind of becoming interested in translation in general, and I was in a class where we were doing that. We were supposed to choose a language and this to translate a poem from, and I decided to translate in English, from English to English, a John Ashbery poem. And kind of the process of like thinking about each word in a poem and the choices that one poet makes, and also kind of like the way the words, the images that the words create in my head when I read your poem, and finding the word in my lexicon that actually kind of represents that image. You know what I mean? There's a kind of like translating from mind to mind or something, or from body to body. How language hits us. I'll maybe somebody else can jump in from there. I'm going to leave it there.
I want to jump in.
Kazim, I took a class from you. Oh, yeah.
You took a class from me at Naropa.
Yeah,
That
and
was
it was Sappho's.
that was a long time ago.
Just a couple of years ago.
Oh, okay.
It's very fresh in my mind because of the Sappho's. I can't remember the name of the book, but the two women authors who had melded fragments of their own and done this kind of translation over time and space was somewhat of a similar exercise kind of thing.
Yeah, because they, Sappho's Gymnasium, a collaborative book by Olga Brumis and T. Begley. And they wrote the first iteration. It's had 3 iterations and it changes each time. So they kind of, on purpose, it sort of shifts a little bit because they think about it. First version of it, they were both living in Provincetown together, and they would get together and recite and write and create the text. And then the third version of it, which is the version that Nightboat Books has published, is T. Begley now lives in Arizona. Olga still lives out on the Cape, not in Provincetown, and so they actually were sending them back and forth by email, and they found that distance space, like erotic in some way that was true to the original version of it. And they talk about it as kind of a translation of Sappho in a way. It's not it's not in the way that we think about translation. It's not a translation of Sappho, but they kind of position it that way. I wanted to just say really quickly, Adra, the project that you described in terms of thinking about the ways that Latin and French and Greek came into English and the politics of that encounter, and then going back to Whitman and kind of leveling this critique and putting that pressure and doing that translation, that sounds like an amazing project to me. And I feel like anybody who didn't want to be on that dissertation committee is like out of their mind. So I hope you're still working on it and completing it. What's the status?
That was not part of my dissertation,
okay.
but I feel encoured. So I'll keep it going.
Am I right? I mean, aren't you guys all like just dying to see this as a book? Yeah, it's incredible. It's really, really. Just last night at UCSD, we hosted, quote unquote, at UCSD, right, on Zoom, but we had Maria Devana Headley, who's done the new Beowulf. And it's this notion of like these canonical texts that we've been governed by, they're not what we think they are. I mean, they've been fixed in time and then they've been situated by all of this scholarship. But within Whitman, as you've shown us, there's this whole other like anarchist Whitman, you know what I mean? And exactly what Susan Howe uncovered in Dickinson when she had her dust up with Ralph Franklin, who was the scholar who was doing all of the textual work, and Susan Howe was making the case for visual intentionality, that Dickinson's line breaks were the way they were supposed to be, and her spacing was the way it's supposed to be, and he denied her, although now that's the mainstream view. You know, however, I think that exchange was in 1986 or what have you. And now, you know, here we are 32 years later, and almost every major Dickinson scholar like Christiane Miller and Marta Werner, and they're all like, yeah, that's pretty much what we believe, you know? So I think you're at the beginning of something that it could be really incredible. I just hope you need to finish it. And I'm not trying to tell you what to do, but I think it's worth doing.
Thanks.
Any questions? Does someone want to jump in? There's actually a question on the chat, which takes us back to the question of sort of space in academia. And I love this one because this is from Cecily, and she says, I feel like this is a totally unanswerable question, but I wanted to ask people with experience. Any tips on how to make space for figuring out what kind of critic I want to be while still surviving in a traditional straight-laced academic environment? I'm an undergrad student in my final year of an English degree at Cambridge, and my assessment was canceled last year, COVID, so passing exams really matters, but I'm also being told by all my supervisors that now's the time to be experimenting and figuring out what kind of critic I want to be. So I think this is one of those heartbreaking questions as a slightly older academic than her, but as someone who's really, really been there, as Adra has also, as I'm sure we all have. It's like, oh, how do you answer that question? Because it's a kind of cognitive dissonance that we all continue to inhabit. But maybe if anyone just wants to give just a brief response to Cecily.
I'm just gonna jump in and say something super quickly. But part of what we're talking about here is like, we're doing it. You guys are doing it. You've created this website. You're publishing this journal. You've created the symposium. So we're doing that. We're doing the work that I talked about. And when I jokingly listed those institutions like Brown, Buffalo, UCSD, maybe Pratt, I mean, there are places that the critical and the creative and the lyrical come together. Certainly, but they don't happen because the institutions decided for them to happen. They happen because the individual faculty members who were there were doing that level of exploration and then did the institutional work to create it. So it's all very unglamorous, the work of building institutions. It's why we started Nightboat Books, because there was like a field of literature out there that we felt that we could make an impact, and so we had to do the work. But a lot of it, as you guys know, very well know for putting this symposium together, it's work. It's just work. You know, it's like building databases and writing emails and getting money. And so you kind of have to have the attitude that the field is the way the field is now because people made the field the way it is now. And if we want a different field, we have to reconfigure it. I believe that's what I believe.
I just wanted to jump in here too to answer a little bit to Cecily as a supervisor at Cambridge. I think that, you know, it is going to be difficult because we're in these institutions trying to make these changes now and thinking about how to reconfigure them. And for the undergraduate students, it can be really confusing, right? So I think it's about trying to find a way to work together maybe and start to push through those boundaries, but it becomes a sort of very constructivist pedagogy in the sense of meeting each other rather than this sort of prescriptive hierarchy.
And also like the Cambridge Tripos might feel like this big thing, but then, you know, I think it will be over and then, you know, you'll meet really interesting people outside of Cambridge and do other things. It won't matter so much in the larger scheme of things, even though it feels like it does at the time. And it's a real, and I understand that it's like a real challenge and it feels kind of threatening and toxic and all of these things, but you get through it and then more exciting things lie ahead.
I would quickly say that every time I've decided the kind of critic I want to be, I've changed my mind at some point. So don't worry about it.
It's all about provisionality. You don't have to have worked it all out yet. Yeah.
That's right. Well, it looks like people are starting to drop off. It's about 12:45. We have marathoned it, so thank you to all of you. And I recorded, I think I had a little snafu at the beginning. I started and then it stopped. And then I started again, but we'll post the recording. Please go to our website. Once I have a list of all the things that I want to say to everybody. Buy our issue. It's really beautiful. Attend other events. The next panel is next Thursday. It's Critical Manifesto, or next Friday, sorry. It's co-hosted by Beyond Criticism, or BC Editions. And it's Andrea Quaid, Ronaldo Wilson, Christina Rivera Garza, and Simon Palfrey of BC Editions. That's next Friday. It's Critical Manifestos again. Let's see, I haven't added the links in the chat yet. But if you hang on as soon as I stop talking, I will do that. But just follow us on Facebook and Instagram. That's also up on our website. If you just kind of click on the little logo at the bottom, I'm sure you all know how to use the internet by now. What else do we want to say, Emma? What have I forgotten?
I mean, thank you to all the panelists. I think this has been such an engaging conversation, and it's been so wonderful. So thank you.
Yes, thank you to you all, fellow panelists and to organizers.
Let's unmute and have one last kind of noise-making session.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. you.
Thank you.